Welcome to our webinar on how to know it's time for divorce. We'll give it about a minute for people to join. Before we get started, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We know you are all very busy, and especially if you're considering a possibility of getting a divorce, you have a lot on your mind. So we really appreciate you taking the time out today to really understand what goes into that decision-making process, and hopefully you'll come out of this webinar with some clear perspective. To get started, I am Nicole. I lead marketing at divorce.com. Divorce.com is an online platform. We offer services to people throughout the entire divorce process. We have divorce resources. We will generate paperwork and forms for your divorce. We also offer mediation sessions to help resolve some differences about the settlement. And then we will help you file with the court to make everything official. All along the way, we're here for you, helping you step by step throughout this entire process, because we know it can be overwhelming. Our mission is to make the entire divorce process less stressful for you and your family. And today that starts with just deciding if it's the right time for you to start this process. So to start that conversation, I would love to introduce Susan Trotter, a relationship expert. Susan, can you introduce yourself and tell people your background?
Sure, great. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm Susan Trotter, and I'm a relationship coach. I started my career as a clinical psychologist, and I practiced as a therapist for over 20 years before shifting to coaching a little over 10 years ago. I do a lot of different things in my practice, but I specialize in helping people who are in relationships and want to improve communication and connection. I also help people who are thinking about or going through divorce to help guide them in making a decision that's best for them and their family. And if it is divorce, help them navigate that process both practically and emotionally. And then additionally, I have expertise in helping people post-divorce figure out what they want that next part of their lives to look like. And for those who are interested in future dating and relationships, I also have expertise in helping people learn how to navigate the dating world as well. And I'm really happy to be here today and joining all of you.
Thank you for joining us. We are definitely very excited to have your background and expertise helping us through this conversation. Before we get started, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping just so everyone can participate. We are encouraging you to ask any questions that you have. You can submit them in the Q&A. It's down below in your Zoom. We'll be monitoring that. We have some time scheduled for the end, but if something is timely as we're talking, we'll also try to get to that. We also just want to have a small disclaimer that we can't give legal advice, so we have other means and methods for us to follow up if it's more specific questions that you have about your circumstances. The webinar today is really meant to be really trying to talk about, general themes. So please keep that in mind as you're submitting those questions. And then last but not least, before we get started, we just want to get a sense for everyone who is joining today, where you are in this process. We have a lot of findings that it takes a long time for people to come to the decision about making, that final decision to get a divorce. So we want to get a sense from you all how long you have been considering this. I think it will help as we're kind of talking through some of the things that you need to be considering if you've been doing this 2 weeks or 2 years. That obviously changes the dynamic of that decision. So I think we can give it probably another 20 seconds for everyone to put in their answers to this. We're looking at anywhere from less than 6 months, 6 months to a year to 2 years, and then 2 years and beyond. And we can see now that it's a little bit of a tie between 1 to 2 years and 2 years plus, which makes sense. We know there's a lot that goes into this decision, and that means it takes time. So appreciate everyone submitting your responses to that. It's very helpful for us to know that the majority of you have been considering this for a while. So with that, Susan, I'm going to hand it off to you to talk about what people should be thinking about in this process.
Great. Thank you again for having me and for the introduction. We know how challenging it is to make a decision like this. And I want to start by just talking about some of the signs that might contribute to people making this decision. And kind of thinking about how difficult their relationship is and whether or not there's some hope of trying to improve it. Some examples of signs that your relationship is really struggling are, of course, things like abuse, infidelity, poor communication or lack of communication. I hear a lot of people are just living very separate lives and remaining married, but living really more like roommates or even barely roommates sometimes. If there's a lot of high conflict, a lot of poor conflict resolution, and oftentimes what I find is people, usually there's one person who is still really invested in the relationship and trying to make it work, and the other spouse may have one foot out the door and is unwilling to work on improving things. These are all different signs that your marriage is struggling and needs some attention in some way. In addition, there's a psychologist by the name of John Gottman, who's kind of a guru in the marriage and relationship world. And he's done a lot of research as well as clinical work. And he's identified 4 communication styles, what he calls the 4 horsemen, that are really signs that when there's a persistent pattern of these behaviors or communication styles, they actually can predict divorce. The 4 horsemen are criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling. Criticism is obvious. Defensiveness is obvious. Stonewalling is when people kind of shut down and they're unwilling to talk. They might give you the silent treatment even. And then contempt is when you really are behaving in a way that's disrespectful to your partner. You might talk about them or to them with disdain. And everybody at some point may, not everybody, but some people may show some signs of these kinds of things. We can all get defensive at certain moments. So what these different communication styles really speak to, it's a style. What that means is that it's a pattern of behavior that is persistent. And when these kinds of styles occur in a relationship, in a marriage, as I said, they are not healthy. They don't show up in a healthy relationship. And the more persistent they are, the more likely they might lead ultimately to divorce, to a decision to make a divorce. One of the other things that I think a lot about in terms of relationships, one of the things that is foundational in a healthy relationship are shared values. And it's really important. And in my work, even with my dating clients, I really encourage people to identify what their core values are and to look for that when they're assessing people that they might date. It's really important when you're in a marriage to check in with each other about what your values are. Values can change over time also. And so it can be really helpful to have those conversations, to talk about core values, to talk about life goals, because of course those can change over time as well. When you have shared values, when you have goals that align, they don't have to be, matching 100%, but you want them to be aligned, then that's great, obviously, for a relationship. When those things are far apart, they can be really, really challenging. And it's important to decide whether or not those things are workable. And again, some of it may have to do with the willingness on the part of both partners to address them. And if not, sometimes not being aligned in those ways can really be a sign that the marriage is going to go down that path. Sometimes people feel ready to divorce, or they're thinking strongly about it. And some of you may be in this place. It sounds like a lot of you have been thinking about it for a very long time, but emotions can sometimes paralyze people. One of the things that I think a lot about in terms of divorce is that there's a lot of grief involved with it. That's really in part what all your emotions might be about if you're thinking about it. And I think thinking about it in the framework of grief can help you to understand what you're feeling. Even if you're the one initiating it, there is still a grief process that people go through because there are so many different kinds of losses inherent in it. There's the potential loss of the relationship, and there are big and little losses throughout. Loss of dreams, future plans, time with your children if you have them. Maybe it's a loss of the person who did all the cooking on every night or took out the garbage. They sound little, but again, all of it is loss. We grieve, and all of the emotions you might have, sadness, anxiety, fear, anger, confusion, all of those different things really can be understood in that context. The challenge is you don't want to get stuck in those emotions. And sometimes having those different emotions, particularly fear and anxiety, can really keep people stuck and really paralyze people and hold them up for years sometimes from making a decision. And so it becomes important not just to understand what you're feeling, but also to really figure out how to manage all those emotions, which are natural to have. How do you manage them, though, in a way that keeps them from keeping you stuck in making a decision about how to move forward in your marriage? I think when people have children, sometimes it can be important to figure out a way to make it work in a way that's really positive. And sometimes staying together is the best thing if both spouses are willing to acknowledge what their part is in the dynamic and are also willing to work on things, truly take ownership for their part and work on things. And sometimes it is better to separate and divorce if these issues that we were talking about, the different signs, the different communication styles and behaviors persist, and there's no chance of improvement because, again, at least one partner is unwilling to work on things. As I said, I work with people also in relationships who do want to improve things. I do a lot of couples work. And one of the things that I find is that people come in and usually each person, each spouse is focused on what the other spouse is doing or not doing. The thing is, we don't have control over other people. We don't have control over what other people do or don't do. And this is an important thing to remember, whether you're staying in your marriage or deciding to get divorced. What we have control over is what we do, the choices that we make about how to respond to whatever is in front of us. And making those choices is actually where our power is. When we focus on what somebody else is doing, we don't actually have control. We think we do, but we really don't. Really focusing on what you have control over, the choices you make, is where your power is. And if you decide to work on things, it's really important to understand that. And if you do decide to get divorced, it's also really important to understand that because you're not going to be able to control still what your spouse does. You will, however, be presented with lots of situations where you get to decide how you want to respond. And again, that is truly the more empowering thing to focus on. So let's talk about emotions like fear, because we know that in divorce there is so much fear, often fear of the unknown, which comes with the process, particularly for those who have not been divorced before. Being in limbo is not a good place, by the way, to be for an extended period of time. And so I really do encourage people to get some support and guidance to make a decision, whatever that decision might be, because staying in limbo for you, for your spouse, if you have children, it's just not a good place to live for too long. And making a decision, even if it is divorce, ultimately will free you up and free everybody up in the family so that you can move forward, because otherwise you just remain stuck. I talked about grief before being part of the process, and so fear goes along with that. And it's really important, again, to get help to work through the grief and not, as I said, get stuck in it. How do you move through all those emotions? One of the big things that I really encourage people to do is to get educated about the process, especially when it comes to fear of the unknown. And divorce is complex. I often say there are some universal truths in divorce, and everybody's situation is unique. And so it's important to get educated about what's common about divorce, legally, financially, and emotionally. Get educated, because knowledge is power. And we don't know what we don't know. And so it becomes essential that you attend webinars like this, that you consult with professionals, join communities, and get as informed as possible. When you are able to get informed, when you can get educated, then you're able to make really sound decisions. And then you don't let your emotions drive your decisions. If you're living in fear and in a place of indecision, then you are allowing fear to make the decision for you. And that doesn't feel good for you or for anybody else. So getting educated, getting informed is one really powerful way to help you move from a place of fear and anxiety and indecision to a place of being able to make really sound, informed decisions about divorce, whether or not to get divorced. And if you do, we'll talk a little bit later about this, but if you do, then about the decisions you need to make about your assets and your children. So getting educated, seeking out support like therapy, coaching, creating community, making sure that you're surrounded by people who are positive, who have good energy, who are going to lift you up and help you move forward. It can be great to vent with people, and have friends and family kind of jump on the bandwagon about how difficult things are. And again, it is another way to stay stuck. Vent, but don't be stuck. And so really make sure you're surrounding yourself with people personally and professionally who are going to help you to move forward with all of this. And truly a good coach or therapist can help guide you in making a decision. Because again, you're having all these different emotions. There's so much that you don't know, and they're going to be able to help facilitate the conversation you need to have with yourself and maybe with your spouse to help you make that decision. And they're also going to be able to connect you to the resources you need, like divorce.com and other professionals to help you move through the process in the best possible way. One of the things that I know often keeps people from moving forward is when they have children. People worry so much about the impact that divorce can have on their children. And a lot of people end up staying together, for the kids. And sometimes they'll say, well, let's stay together till they go off to college. And then we'll get divorced. And I genuinely think that is what is best. I do think, as I said earlier, when people have children, if you are both willing to work on things and you can find a way to stay together in a healthy relationship for you and your children, that's great. And I encourage people to make that attempt to try to work things out. And sometimes it's not what's best for the kids. And I think it's really important for people to give thought to what you, as a couple, what you are modeling for your children in terms of love and marriage and communication and conflict. What are you modeling for them? Our children are watching everything, and their perspective is limited. They don't have access to the whole world, especially when they're younger. And so if you do, particularly when you have younger children, you want to give thought to what you're modeling for them about these things, and decide, like, is whatever the dynamic in your relationship, what you want your kids to grow up thinking is what is normal in terms of love and marriage and relationships, and again, communication and affection and intimacy and so forth. If you do decide to get divorced, there is research that suggests that kids do best when they have happy parents, even if the parents are not together. And again, there's research that bears that out. Research also suggests that divorce in and of itself doesn't negatively impact children. It's really about how the parents manage it. And high conflict situations tend to obviously have more of an impact on children. And how you manage it, even in that situation, really does matter. What I say to people who are in, even if they're in a high conflict marriage and or divorce, you can still mitigate the impact on your children. More research suggests that as long as children have at least one parental figure who is stable and sane, they will generally do okay. So as I always tell my clients, be that person for your children, because it really does make a difference. Again, what I talked about earlier is you can't control what anybody else does. And if you do decide to get divorced, you're not going to be able to control what your spouse does or former spouse does. You do always have control over what you do and how you handle things. And there is a way to manage it with your children and to show up for them that will help, as I said, to mitigate whatever is coming from the other side and to mitigate whatever the impact is of the divorce, if that's what you decide to do. Obviously, we can't totally escape the impact that divorce has on kids. Typically, parents separate. When kids are younger, there's a parenting plan. Kids split time between parents. If there's conflict, they deal with that and so forth. So there's no getting around there being some impact. And again, how you manage it matters. One of the golden rules is divorce is not to put children in the middle. They come from both of you. And so what it feels like to them, if you talk negatively about the other parent or you put them in the middle, it's as if you're talking negatively about them. That's how they experience it because they come from both of you typically. And so you really want to make sure that you don't put them in the middle, that you don't talk negatively about the other parent. If the other parent is behaving badly in some way and your child comes to you and talks about that, there are ways to talk with them without putting down the other parent. You can be matter of fact, like let's say a parent gets mad at a child for not being more talkative on the phone at night. And the child gets upset about that because the other parent is mad at them for being tired and not talkative. Instead of saying, oh, your parent is such a jerk, you could say, I'm really sorry that happened. Most parents don't get mad at their kids for being tired. Let's talk about how you can manage it next time so you feel better about it. And so you empathize, you validate what they're feeling, kind of a reality check so they don't internalize it. And then you try to empower them by problem solving about how they can manage that. I think it's also really important to really use what is truly in their best interest as a guiding principle in all the decisions that you make. And obviously, you and your spouse may have different ideas about what's in the best interest of your children, and still keep that as a guiding principle because it really does make all the decisions much easier. I heard somebody say once when they were thinking about divorce and struggling with it, that they love their children more than they dislike the other parent. And that became kind of a mantra for them and made decisions really easy because it helps you keep the focus where it needs to be. Again, how you manage the relationship, what you're modeling for your children. Again, when kids are younger, they're still kind of learning and looking to you as models for things. When kids are older, one of the challenges with waiting until they're older sometimes, and if, they go off to college and then you announce to them, we're getting divorced, sometimes older kids can feel, confused and even kind of betrayed because then they makes them wonder like, well, what were the last 18, 20 years, about? Their experience of it was one thing, and now you're essentially telling them, well, it wasn't quite what you thought it was. And so, just give thought again as you're trying to make a decision as to what you're modeling, what you're representing for your children, what their takeaway is going to be. And that can really, again, help guide you in making the decision. Oftentimes there's, in terms of kids and the impact, there's more tension initially during the divorce process. There may be more tension in the immediate aftermath. Ideally, everybody kind of settles in at some point, and people start to focus more on their own lives and moving forward, and things typically will get calmer. And there are even some amicable situations where families still, dine together. They might go on vacation together, spend holidays together. It's less common, and it is still possible. So those are all some of the different things. I just to kind of quickly summarize before I move on to the next topic. Signs that your marriage is struggling are, again, things like ongoing abuse, infidelity, poor communication, living separate lives. I talked about the four horsemen: criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, and contempt. Any kind of persistent pattern that creates an unhealthy dynamic and unhealthy relationship, with no chance of improvement because one or both of you isn't willing to put in the work, is a sign that your marriage is in trouble and that you might want to consider divorce. Again, if both of you are willing to put in the work, short of abuse, a lot of things are workable if both parties are willing to work on it. But it doesn't, you didn't get there overnight. It doesn't happen overnight. It really does take a commitment and effort and time, and a lot of investment of emotion to try to improve things depending on where you are in that process. In terms of children, it will impact them, and there are ways to mitigate some of that impact by staying focused on what's important, which is their best interest. Using them to help you make the decision in terms of what you're modeling for them, and what you want them to kind of take away about marriage and relationships. So let's talk about, let's say you are closer to making a decision. What are the next steps? What kind of goals might you have? How do you start to plan for this? Again, I said earlier that it is essential to get educated so that you can make informed decisions and not emotionally driven decisions. What we know in divorce is that when people make emotionally driven decisions, the process tends to last longer, be more stressful, cost more money, and not necessarily result in the best possible outcomes for you and your family. That's just what happens. It doesn't mean you're not going to have emotions. I talked earlier also about all the grief, all the different emotions that people have in this process when you're trying to decide and when you're going through it. Our emotions are just understandable reactions to a situation. There's nothing wrong with having emotions. It is what you do with them that is important. And if you're making this decision and you're pursuing a divorce, it's essential that you develop strategies for managing those emotions so that they don't get in the way of making the really important decisions you need to make. The question is, how do you do that? How do you make these kinds of decisions? And when I worked as a therapist and as a coach, when I'm helping people with things outside of divorce, I generally tell people, don't make any major decisions when you're going through a major life crisis. Divorce is a major life crisis, and you have some really important decisions to make, again, about your assets, about your children, your home, and so forth. And so how do you do that? How do you make decisions when you're in the middle of this huge, huge challenge? Again, getting educated is key. By attending webinars, reading, joining support groups, and so forth. Creating a team of professionals, consulting with professionals like attorneys or mediators, financial advisors, realtors, mortgage professionals, therapists or coaches. Really making sure that you are connecting with the right people and accessing the right resources. Organizations like divorce.com are great because they have so many resources. They have these webinars, they have recorded, they have articles, they have professionals. I mean, it really does make such a huge difference when you are aware of what the resources are, when you have good professionals that you can consult with, and essentially when you get educated about the divorce process. It impacts every part of your life. And so you really do need to understand legally, financially, and emotionally, all the different parts to it. Again, more generally, and then of course, specific to your situation. I encourage people to set goals with your professionals, with each one. What are your goals financially? What are your goals emotionally? Where do you want to be? Like, let's say if you decide to get divorced, where do you want to be during the process? Where do you want to be a day after, a year out, 5, 10, 20 years out? It's really important to be thinking about goals post-divorce early on in the process, because the decisions that you make now will impact that. And I typically will say, you don't want to just be thinking about what you want the divorce agreement to look like. You really want to be thinking about what you want your life to look like years out. What are some of the next steps? Some of those next steps to turn a decision to get divorced into an action plan, getting educated, getting the support, creating your team. I really encourage people, again, to understand the emotions that you may have in this process, because you will have them, and it's not linear, and it's sometimes 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and everybody's journey looks different. So it's really important to get support individually, to look for groups, to create community again around you, so that you can have all these resources to help you with the emotional part of it. Working with the right team is also really important. I also really encourage people to pay attention to self-care. It's kind of a buzzword or term, and it is actually really, really important. When we take better care of ourselves, where we are much better at making decisions, at managing our emotions, and showing up for the people in our lives, including our children. So that piece is really, really important. Again, making sure that you surround yourself with good people. I also encourage people to pay attention to mindset. I do a lot of work about mindset. Mindset, for those that aren't, also buzzword, but if you're not really familiar with it, mindset is really about how you think, and how you think affects how you feel, it affects what you do, and it affects outcomes. So indirectly, how you think about things can lead to the results that you get. When you think about that in terms of making a decision about your marriage, and if it is divorce, going through that divorce process, it means that your thoughts are really, really powerful. And so you want to take some time and get some help if you need it, to really identify what your patterns of thinking are, and assess whether they're serving you well or not. And to the extent that they're not, find a way to shift your mindset, shift how you're thinking, because it really can make, as I said, a huge difference in how you feel, what you do, and the results that you get. And when it comes to making a decision about your marriage, and particularly about divorce, or going through the divorce process, it really is impactful, paying attention to how you think about things. One of the other things I often will tell people and remind people is that there are so many different pieces to divorce, and every step is still a step, no matter how small it is. I often use the kind of like a metaphor of the stairs. You can't jump from the first step to the top step in one fell swoop. You actually really do need to kind of take all the steps to get to the top. And so if you think about divorce and all the different steps inherent in it, you just start with small steps, one little piece at a time, and eventually, with the right support, you will get there. But it's helpful to keep in mind that even the smallest step is helping you to move forward. And sometimes it can feel like nothing's happening and you're not really doing anything, but it really, every little step makes a difference. One of the other things I encourage people to give thought to in the process too is that, when you are in a challenging relationship, when you're going through divorce, and there are lots of challenges in that, everything feels important when you're going through it. And sometimes everything can feel worthy of a fight. And I encourage people to really give thought to what is worth fighting and what's not. There's a term, and actually I have an attorney mediator friend who wrote a blog and a poem and a rap about this, called The Price of Peace. Not everything is actually worth fighting over, and it's really important to give thought to what your price of peace is, and it's going to look different for everybody. And I'm not suggesting that people just roll over and be taken advantage of and not advocate for themselves. I always encourage people to advocate for themselves and for their children. And some things may be better to let go if it brings peace into your life. And maybe it's about, a piece of furniture or, an extra hour here or whatever the case might be. It's going to be different for everybody. But giving thought to what your price of peace is in a relationship and in the divorce process can be really, really powerful. And sometimes choosing to let something go is the stronger thing to do, even though it feels counterintuitive. Letting go sometimes is really, really helpful. So making the decision to divorce can be really challenging. If you do decide to get divorced, it's really important to gather the resources that are available to you, to help you get through it ultimately, like, these webinars, to get through it with confidence and peace of mind and be set up to thrive in your life after divorce. And again, that part is really, really important. I often say when life is going along smoothly, we just kind of go along for the ride. We don't really stop and think about it. It's only when we hit bumps in the road that we tend to pause, we reflect. It's often when people seek out help. If you're on this webinar, you've been thinking about divorce, or maybe you are going through the process, it's a really big bump in the road to be thinking about divorce or to make that decision to get divorced and go through it. It is a good time to get help. I also think it's those bumps in the road that, as challenging as they are, and divorce can be challenging, it's those bumps in the road that also provide for us the greatest opportunities for personal growth and positive change. And it can be hard when you're in it to imagine that or to think about it in that context. And I just want you to tuck away that idea, that as challenging as your situation might be right now, it can provide an opportunity for you in terms of growth and change, and it can lead to something even better than you imagined. And again, it might be hard to see it now. And my hope, of course, is that you will get to that place and be able to create a life for yourself that is full and joyful, good and healthy for you and for your children. I'm going to stop there. I think there are probably some questions in the Q&A that have come in, and I want to make sure we leave some time for that.
Great. Thank you, first of all, for giving such great insight and advice. There's a lot. I was taking notes as you were talking that I took away from this, so hopefully everyone else feels similarly. We did have a few questions. One is about, you were talking at the very beginning about the signs and how important values can be in a relationship. How do you coach people around politics and values, and like how should people be thinking about that? Do you have any insights there?
Yeah. Well, obviously politics has become a big topic, in marriages and also in the dating world. I see it as well.
Mm.
And politics has become about more than just politics. That's the question, more specifically about how to
Just a
manage
values
conversation?
disalignment when
Okay.
both people have different views on politics.
Yeah. Well, it is a more challenging thing, and I think we're seeing more and more people really struggling with this in their marriages. Some couples may decide not to talk about it, but I do encourage people to have those conversations. Uh, One of the things that I really recommend when I'm working with couples actually is for people to be curious with each other, to understand, to ask questions that are more open-ended and to try to really listen and really understand where the other person is coming from. We don't necessarily always have to agree, but ideally in a relationship, excuse me, we come to understand, and we at least can be respectful, even if we don't agree, to still be respectful of the other person's opinions. There is a challenge, of course, as I said, when values aren't aligned, and couples may really struggle with how to get to some middle ground. And probably if their values don't align, they're going to need somebody, professional therapist or coach, to guide them in those conversations and see if they can get to some middle ground. And if they're so far apart that no middle ground is possible and they can't kind of find a way to respect those differences, unfortunately, it may ultimately lead them down a path toward divorce.
Thank you. The other question that I had was, you talked a lot about, the middle ground, or, you start at the bottom stair and you can't jump all the way to the top stair. Many people in the middle will do a separation period. How should people be approaching that, knowing that some people will ultimately reconcile, others will not? It's that middle step. Is there anything that you would say to people who are considering that as that middle step?
Sure. So I think people can get stuck in the middle step sometimes.
Mhm.
Also, I mean, I've seen people who have been separated for upwards of 10 years, sometimes not able to move in either direction. Um, I think that when people are separated, it's important to have the conversation about, what is the goal of the separation? It can be helpful to have that conversation at the beginning of the separation, and depending on how things go, you may need to check in with each other periodically to see if the goal remains the same. If it is to just get some space and maybe try to reconcile, then people need to actively be working on that. You can't be separated and living totally separate lives and still think you might reconcile if you're not working, having a place to communicate and work on the things that led to the separation. Obviously, if the goal of the separation ultimately is to lead to divorce, then it's important to keep taking those steps to move things forward. All the things that we talked about here earlier tonight. I just encourage people again not to live in limbo for too long a period of time, because it really can be unhealthy for everybody involved. And so making a decision and moving forward, taking those steps, whatever that might look like for you and your family, is ultimately better for you and your family.
Got it. I so appreciate all of the wisdom that you've given us. We're approaching time here. There was actually another question about this. We will be sharing out the recording so that you can play back. There was another question about the team of people that people can go to for support, whether that's therapist or understanding the legal process, which was discussed earlier in the recording. So you can definitely go back and look at that. We will be sending out an email to everyone who attended so that you have access to that sometime later this week. So be on the lookout. And then obviously you can always come back to divorce.com for more resources, more education. As Susan was talking about, educating yourself on this process will give you a lot of power in understanding what your options are and taking away some of that fear of the unknown. So we encourage all of you to do that. And thank you again for everyone who attended, and Susan for sharing such great wisdom and insights. Thanks, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful day and be on the lookout for more information.